Hello, so today I'm going to talk to you about forecasting. So here are the objectives for today. The outline of what I'm going to go over. Talk a little about forecasting, the importance of it, and then how some different methods you can use in terms of forecasting. So what is forecasting? Well, it's the process of predicting some future event. And we often care about forecasting for many reasons. Often if someone wants to determine if a project is going to be successful, then we'll look and try to forecast, well, how much money will this save us down the road? And so essentially you're doing a forecast. Really, anytime you're trying to predict future demand, future anything, then you're doing a forecast. So if you look at Disney and how they use forecasting, they're very successful with this. And so they generate actually daily forecasts. You can look at the military, for example. Maybe we do an annual forecast for our budget. Well, Disney does these things on a daily basis. And so you see, how do they come up with their forecast? Well, they survey all these different guests, employees, travel professionals, and kind of take all these kind of inputs into a model that spits out a forecast. Their average forecast error for the 5-year forecast is 5%. So you'd argue that, well, is that high? Is that low? That's actually really good. So forecast error 5%, and this is with surveying 1 million guests, employees, and travel professionals. So they're still off 5% by doing all of those things. Now you can only imagine how you get a much larger forecast error when you don't go through this type of effort. So why is forecasting important in the healthcare setting? Okay, so think about it for a minute. Again, we're trying to predict something in the future. Why do we care about predicting? So take flu vaccines, for example. We need to make sure we have enough flu vaccines available. So what we're trying to do is predict what the demand will be for the flu season this coming year. Because you have to buy the supplies so far in advance, or you're left scrambling trying to come up with them last minute and often pay extra money for these last minute supplies. So forecasting, you're trying to make sure you can meet the demand of your customers, which are patients in healthcare. Okay, so you can have different forecasting time horizons. Short range is up to a year, medium, and then long range. And there's reasons why you would want to do each of these. A long range is for large planning endeavors, major changes to your production line or the population you're serving. And then shorter medium are for more of those smaller types of changes or smaller impact changes. Short range forecast tends to be more accurate than the long range forecast. And so long range is great, but then you'd want to make adjustments perhaps the following year. So if I did a 5-year forecast, maybe another year in, I'm making an adjustment. So you're continuously updating that 5-year forecast. It's not a static forecast. So what's the strategic importance? Well, you really want it for supply chain management. We talked about flu vaccines. Do I have enough vaccines in the pipeline? Have I ordered enough vaccines to see our patients? Do I have enough pharmaceuticals on hand to see our patients? Again, in healthcare, very, very important, but very important in all industries. Human resources. Do we have enough employees? How many employees do we project to move this summer? We think of turnover. What's our annual turnover projected to be? Again, it's very important if we can get this accurate. So with a more accurate forecast, you can hire more workers in terms of human resources, or you can get hiring packages ready to go with an expectation that I'm going to need to fill these. In the military, you can identify who's going to PCS, have a permanent change of station, and then try to get some backfills for those people. Capacity is the other side. Do we have enough capacity to meet the demand? If we don't, we lose customers. Potentially longer term, we lose market share. So reality is, we talked about the Disney forecast. Disney forecast isn't even accurate. Not within a percent. The 5-year forecast is within 5%. Absolutely fantastic. But again, it's not perfect. There's outside factors and other things that are unknown to you and your forecasting inputs. You're not going to be able to input everything into some forecasting model. You want to do the best you possibly can. So here's some approaches for how you can do that. You can take a qualitative method, meaning you're going to go out and talk to people rather than crunch some hard numbers. And so this is used when the situation is new. There's very little data out there on it. And we'll get into some methods for this. Quantitative methods used when the situation is more stable and you have historical numbers. Again, this is using numbers. For both of those, we'll talk more about methods. So here's the qualitative methods. So you could have an executive opinion, these high-level experts, and ask them what they think and develop a forecast based on that. The Delphi method takes a panel of experts. So whereas the jury of executive opinion was more of pooling an opinion of experts, here you're going to get a group of people together, a panel, and you're going to have a discussion. You could take a Salesforce composite, so estimates from multiple different Salesforce members, again, not necessarily based on hard past data. And again, we're talking more with up-and-coming, newer companies, newer products, or it's largely unknown and you don't have much historical data. So this would often apply if you think of, let's say, an upstart, a new technology company. Think of maybe all these new apps. And newer companies that start out, they may want to take that approach. And then you could have a market survey where you just simply ask the customer. So jury of executive opinion, I mentioned that before, but you have a small group of high-level experts. So again, think of these people as kind of the knowledge experts in the field, and then you're going to try to use some statistical model if possible to combine with that experience of these executives. The disadvantage here is you get a group of people together and the creativity goes away. There's that group think where somebody says something and the next person just says, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, and then they shut down, or somebody's opinion is shut down and then they really don't comment much further. The Delphi method, iterative group process. Okay, we talked there. They get together as a group and you go around and around and you keep doing it with these decision makers, the staff that are administrating it, and the respondents. Ultimately, you want to reach some sort of consensus with this method. So the consensus forecast. Salesforce composite. Each person would project his or her sales, and the idea here is the sales reps know their customers. Okay, the market survey, it's just like what it says. You go out to your customers and you ask what they want, what they say. Now this doesn't, the evidence has shown that this method is somewhat flawed in that people will say they will buy something, they will say they will participate in something, but do they? Often the participation is much less than what you'd think. You can take a volunteer golf outing, for example. Many of you are familiar with this. And so a lot of people will sign up. Well, do people back out last minute? Does everybody show up that says they're going to show up? So if you forecast it out that I'm going to have 40 people there, you might end up with 20. Again, overly optimistic. Forecasting variation, some components. You can have trend, seasonal, cyclical, and random, and I'll show each one of these. So the trend component is kind of persistent up or downward trends. So you have this line here. This is a persistent downward trend. So think of it kind of your slope. You have it consistent. It's not going up and down. Seasonal component. So now we're talking about maybe there's a flu season. So the volume spikes during a specific season. You might think of sports teams and maybe sports apparel. Well, it'll probably spike around the time there's an actual season for that sport. I mean, football will spike probably in the fall. So there are reasons why there's these big up and down changes. Monday's typically a very busy day in the emergency department. And people didn't want to go in on the weekend and interrupt their weekend, so they go in for some more minor issues on Mondays. Cyclical is kind of the up and down, up and down. So the trend up, but then there's also the trend down. So we go up and we go down. And it tends to happen over a long period of time. And the random component is just like what it says. It is completely random. It's really hard to pinpoint what happened there. And that's fine. There is going to be that sort of a component to forecasting. So with determining the quantitative approach to take, there's many different ones. I'm only going to go over 5, and I'll show you how they go from less complicated in this naive approach to more complicated in this linear regression. So think of this moving kind of along a continuum of less to more challenging, more inputs. Okay, so the naive approach is pretty much what it says. It's naive. So if January sales are 68, then I'm going to say February sales were 68. Okay, so it's picking the last period's demand and just saying that is what we're going to have next period. Very, very simple. So the moving average takes a period of time, and you define what that period of time is, what this N is down here. This can be anything you want. It can be a 3-month moving average, it could be a 6-month, whatever you want to do. But you've picked a period of time, and then you're going to average out for those previous periods. So I'll show you an example here. If these are actual sales in this column here, and I want to get the 3-month moving average for April, I'm going to take the 3 previous months average and 3 previous months and then just average those. And so that will give me a projection or a forecast of 11 2/3 for April. So now when I move to May and so on, you're just going to be doing exactly the same thing. So as 1 month passes, then I have a new 3-month moving average. So here I started in April. I was forecasting for April, and so I took into consideration actuals for January, February, and March. If I want to now forecast for May, well then what do? I take the actuals for April, March, and February. So all you do is you're only using 3 months worth of data if I do a 3-month moving average. And so that older data just kind of falls off and you're building more current. So the weighted moving average is just slightly different than the moving average. Same concept in that you have demand and you've picked a certain amount of time that you're looking at. But here what you're considering are weights. You didn't have this in the previous example. So here I'm going to show an example with the weights. And so you're going to apply in this example a weight of 3 for the last month because that's most current, and so you think that that should have the highest weight. And then 2 months ago we'll get a weight of 2, and then 3 months ago we'll get a weight of 1. Then you sum those up. So what do you have here in April? I have, again, we take these actuals. I've given a weight of 3 for the most current month, so 13 times 3, and then I have 2, a weight of 2 for 2 months ago, which is February, and that's times 12, and then you get plus, and it's 1, a weight of 1 here, and that's 1 times 10, which is 10. Then you divide that by the sum of all the weights, which was 3 plus 2 plus 1, gives you 6, and that gives you this moving average. So the only difference is that you're in this case, you're giving greater weights to more recent sales, but you can really weight however you want. So this example gave greater weights to more recent sales, but you have the luxury of changing that as you see fit. Okay, so potential problems with the moving average. So increasing the number of periods smooths the forecast but makes it less sensitive to changes. So if I decide to do a 6-month moving average, there's going to be less change from month to month in my average because I've kind of smoothed it out. I've added more periods of time. And then the moving average does not necessarily forecast trends well. So we talked about maybe flu season occurred in the fall. Well, if I'm only looking at the last 3 months, I'm not going to catch that trend. And then it does require a lot of historical data if you want to do a moving average and do it well. So smoothing. Now smoothing is a slightly different approach. What you're trying to do is you're assigning a smoothing constant, a value for that smoothing constant. You can assign the value from 0 to 1. Okay, we'll show you how the impact of how you assign that value, what that does to your forecast. Okay, so this is a form of weighted moving average, again with this smoothing constant. So what you're doing is you take your last period's forecast, and that's your starting point. And then you look at the last period's actual demand minus their forecast. So how accurate was your forecast? And you're taking that smoothing constant right here and multiplying it by that accuracy. So how accurate were you? And so if you were perfectly accurate, meaning your actual demand was exactly the same as your forecast, well then your new forecast would just be the same as your old forecast. That's all it's saying here. So ultimately your new forecast will be a factor of your previous period's forecast plus, again, how accurate you were in terms of your last forecast. And here's an example that you can see with a smoothing constant of 0.20. So again, we started with this previous forecast, and we added in the smoothing constant times how accurate we were on our previous forecast. Okay, so we predicted 142, we actually had 153. So we were fairly accurate, but we were off by 11, and then you'd multiply that 11 by the 0.2 and add it to the 142. Okay, smoothing constants generally are within the range of 0.05 to 0.5. As the smoothing constant increases, the older values become less significant. It's pointed out in this chart. So the impact of a different smoothing value or smoothing constant, if you have a lower smoothing constant, you're going to have a flatter line, flatter forecast over time. And the reason is because you're not paying as much attention or giving as much weight to that difference. And I'll go back a couple slides here. This right here, you're not giving as much value or as much weight to the actual forecast compared to the actual demand versus your forecast. Okay, as this amount gets lower, this entire part of the equation becomes less relevant, and you're going more off of simply the previous period's forecast here. So again, if this is higher on the other hand, then you're giving more value or more weight to the actual forecast compared to your actual demand versus your forecast. Okay, so you'd want to choose high values of the smoothing constant when the underlying average is likely to change. Okay, remember, so that would allow there to be greater fluctuations in your average over time. If the underlying average is stable, well, then you'd have a flatter line, and that's fine to have a low value of a smoothing constant. And here's just an example that you can see with a smoothing constant of 0.10 and what the numbers end up being in your forecast. And then here a forecast with a smoothing constant of this and the same numbers otherwise. Obviously, when you look at this, one thing that would stand out to me is you see this forecast here with a smoothing constant of 0.10, relatively flat. The range is not very wide. It's only a range of 175 to 178.59. Here the range is a little wider, 175 to this 184. Again, we talked about why that's the case. Common measures of error, mean absolute deviation. So what this does is it simply is a way to measure your overall error in your forecast over time. So here we'd have the actual, it's the actual forecast, or actual demand, sorry, minus the forecast divided by the number of periods. And it's the actual minus the forecast, it's the absolute value of that number. So it's a sum of the absolute value of the actual demand minus the forecast, and then you just divide that by the number of periods. A lower MAD, or mean absolute deviation, is better generally. And I'll show you here how you'd calculate it with this example. So here you have 8 periods. You have quarter 1 all the way through 8. And you have a sum of deviations, absolute deviations of 82.45. And to get that, what you just do, you see here's the actual demand or actual tonnage loaded, and you'd subtract the forecast, gives you a difference of 5. So your forecast was off, it was wrong by 5. Same thing here. And again, we're doing absolute values here, so there's no negative. And then you just sum that all up to get the 82, divide by the number of periods, which in this case is 8, and that gives you this value here. Tracking signal is the last thing I'm going to talk about. And the tracking signal is a ratio of cumulative forecast errors. The difference between this and the mean absolute deviation is this does take into consideration negatives. So if I said my forecast was 10 and my actual demand was 20, well then I am off by 10. Okay, my forecast was wrong by 10. Let me go back and show you this, how it would look. So here, this is 5, so I'm off by 5. This number in that case, with a tracking signal calculation, would be negative 7.50 because we actually had less than what we forecasted. Okay, so when you're running the cumulative numbers, then the cumulative at this point would be negative 2.5, meaning my actuals were 2.5 less than what I forecasted. And then you'd continue that and get the cumulative number at the end of the forecasting period. And then to just divide that by your mean absolute deviation. Okay, so what this does is it assesses kind of your overall, the advantage here is it considers the pluses and the minuses to give at the end of the day, if I summed up all of my errors, am I really off? Meaning maybe one quarter I was off by 10, maybe the next quarter I was I ordered 10 less than what I was supposed to. Next quarter I forecasted and I ordered 10 more than what I was supposed to. Ultimately, you have the right amount. So maybe you were wrong in a given period, but that netted out to 0. So we really don't have much of or we don't have any cumulative forecast error in that case. Okay, and associative forecasting is the last one, and that really, the most common one method for this is just linear regression. So what you're trying to do is, again, forecast or predict the y, and that's your dependent variable, and it's based on some inputs that you'd have, meaning with those independent variables. So maybe I'm trying to forecast sales, and so I have different variables. I have the month is a variable. I have the store location might be a variable. The department might be a variable. I could have all sorts of different variables, and ultimately it's going to tell me what this y, or what this, in other words, what the demand or the forecast should be. Okay, and here's how you get an example. Here, if I have a formula set up like this after my regression showed this to be true, based on historical data, I plugged in numbers, it told me this is my regression equation. Well, then if payroll next year is projected to be 6 billion, then I would expect, I just plug in 6 billion here, and my sales would be expected to be this. Okay, multiple regression analysis does the same thing, but again, you're adding in multiple independent variables or inputs right here. So instead of just looking at payroll, you'd add in payroll again plus the store plus whatever else you want to look at. And again, here's an example of how that could play out. Okay, some of the slides are from Pearson Publishing, and that is all I have today. Thank you.